Welcome to the DNA Talks podcast, where we take on the mission of unlocking the code of your genetics. This season is all about you, upgrading your health, not just on the surface, but down to the root cause. Join us as your clinicians at the DNA company investigate your DNA and beyond. The intention of this podcast is to enhance your lifestyle by changing what is in your control. This does not substitute the medical advice given by your personal doctor, therapist, and other healthcare professionals.
What is happiness? Is it something that we experience, something we chase, or maybe it's even something we create? How do our genetics, our environment, and even choices shape the way we feel? And with rates of anxiety and depression skyrocketing these days, especially among young people, what can we do to reclaim happiness, our God-given right in this fast-paced, always connected world? To help us unpack these big questions, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Gillian Mandich to the podcast. As a world-renowned happiness researcher and founder of the International Happiness Institute. In fact, I'm not just happy, I'm thrilled, I'm elated, I'm overjoyed, and I'm ecstatic. Words that take even happiness to the next level. And to introduce you to her is a real pleasure. She's somebody who's dedicated her life to understanding and sharing what truly makes us thrive. Dr. Gillian Mandich is a leading happiness researcher with a PhD in health science, specializing in health promotion. As the founder of the International Happiness Institute of Health Science Research, she's dedicated to translating cutting-edge research into actionable strategies that help individuals and organizations improve well-being, productivity, and quality of life. Dr. Mandich is also a research associate at the World Database of Happiness in the Netherlands, a happy population, by the way, which we'll talk about, and co-leads the Canadian Happiness at Work study in partnership with the Canadian Mental Health Association, CAMH, exploring how workplaces can foster joy and engagement. And she also consults for SickKids Hospital on Meant to Prevent, a groundbreaking initiative uniting all 13 of Canada's children's hospitals to promote healthy habits for families and youth. Also, a sought-after two-time TEDx speaker and frequent guest on numerous national TV shows, Dr. Mandich is here today to share the science, strategies, and inspiration for living a happier, healthier life. Thank you so much for joining us. We all need more of what you bring.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, let's start off with the first question that's burning for me. What makes Dr. Mandich happy?
Well, I'm currently sitting next to my 3-year-old French bulldog, Jocko, and he makes me happy. And I also want to give a caveat to anyone listening. He is a French bulldog, and he snores and he snorts. So if at any time during this conversation you think you hear snoring, it's not me putting myself to sleep. It is my French bulldog, Jocko, who makes me happy.
I've met the guy personally, and you look at him, and the first thing that comes to mind is you feel relaxed, you feel better. Pets are known to really invoke that state of relaxation and happiness in others, in humans. That's why I suppose we call dog our man's best friend. Tell us a little bit about, before we get into the nitty gritty of the science and research around happiness. What is he doing for people? Like, this is, he's part of your practice essentially.
Yeah, he is. So Jocko is a very busy guy. He has 2 jobs. So he is a model for Canada Pooch. It's like this dog brand. And so I have so many amazing, oh, he's already snoring. I have amazing high resolution photos. So whenever I do talks, I put in photos of Jocko in his cute little outfits to bring bonus happiness to my talks. And then his other job, he works in pet therapy at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, CAMH. And so Jocko goes in and he volunteers once a week for an hour. And they have, actually, last count, 33 working dogs at the hospital in a variety of different areas across the hospital. And they go to bring joy to the clients there. So Jocko works in critical care. So critical care is where someone would go at CAMH if they were in psychiatric crisis. And he brings joy. And I witness it every single week firsthand, how interacting with Jocko or with the dogs, it really does bring joy. And it's just one of the best hours of my week. It's
Well, and
also
that's why he's snoring. He's tired. He does a lot. He's working overtime. He's a busy guy. It's funny what I've recently researched around. And this is getting a little bit into some of the physiology of happiness, and we'll come back to that maybe a little bit from now. But when you pet a dog, and even when you're in proximity to a dog, or your furry friend of preference, it actually changes heart rate variability and something called coherence in the body. I didn't know that before. I thought that was really a human to human connection, but even with animals. And so that sort of reestablishment of optimal heart rate and the variability that coincides with that tells your brain, your heart tells your brain that everything's going to be okay. I was really, pretty excited to read some of that preliminary research. Okay, so look, we all want to be happier, but is the intention or perhaps the desire to be happier enough to achieve happiness?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And so I've learned a lot about happiness since I got into this field. And I've had to sort of unlearn a lot of things because, were you taught how to be happy in school growing up?
Not me.
Not me
If
either.
anything,
So
I remember being indirectly taught how to be anxious over certain things, worried about my next test, or a little nervous about my next assignment. But there was certainly no recourse on the happiness side.
Yeah. And so, no, we have to give ourselves some grace because it's not like we were taught how to be happy. And then we have media and marketing and social media and movies and Hallmark movies telling us what happiness is supposed to be. I'm doing like air quotes, right? So no wonder we're confused. And even when I first got in, so I actually didn't even know you could study happiness until the second year of my PhD. So my research background is actually childhood obesity. And in the second year of my PhD, when I learned that studying happiness is a thing, I started looking at, I wonder, is there a connection between happiness and health? Because I was in health science. And there's a ton of data that basically shows when you compare happy people to less happy people in terms of our physical health, happier people have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. They have stronger immune systems. They heal faster from injury. They tend to make better nutritional choices. They tend to sleep better, both in terms of duration and quality. So there's a lot of benefits to our physical health. So I thought, this sounds like a much more interesting, inclusive thing for me to study than childhood obesity. And so I switched. And as I was switching, when you start to study happiness, it sort of forces some personal reflection too, right? You start to ask yourself, well, Gillian, are you as happy as you possibly could be? And so, I sat with it and my answer was no. So I thought, okay, here I am, this naive grad student. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to learn how to study happiness. And I don't like feeling sad. I don't like feeling anxious. I don't like feeling down, depressed.
Who does?
So why don't I just figure out how to get rid of all of those feelings and just figure out how to be happy all the time? And that was my goal going into my PhD. How do we be happy all the time? Then you start to get into the literature. And what we see is, and sometimes in the academic work, it's referred to as the dark side of happiness, where what we see is that people that try to be happy all of the time end up being less happy than other people. Because it's impossible to be happy all the time. It is impossible. So if that's your goal, you have set an impossible goal. And so what I learned is in terms of healthy psychological functioning, it's really about embracing a spectrum of emotions. Can we be happier than we are right now? Absolutely. Because a lot of our happiness is a skill-based learned behavior. But can we be happy all of the time? Absolutely not. It's funny. Sometimes you don't realize what people sort of think about you. And a lot of times I'll have people ask me, because they think I study happiness, I'm happy all the time. And I was no, I'm not happy all the time, but nor do I wish to be, nor do I wish for you to be, or for anyone listening, because that's not the point. And I think that that's a really important first part of this conversation, because what that does is it gives us grace to be a human, to have feelings, if we're not having a good day, to know it's okay because we're not doing something wrong because we're not feeling happy all the time,
Well, I really appreciate you've established such an excellent level of expectation for this conversation, because I'm imagining a lot of folks out there thinking not only what are these tips, tricks, tidbits, science around getting happier, but is it my goal to achieve happiness consistently? And what you're saying is, let's debunk that out of the gate. And by the way, like you, your experience and many holding you accountable to potentially being happy all the time because you know the most about it is akin, I feel like, to me being accountable for everything I put in my body, being that I'm in
Yeah.
natural medicine. I've encountered, people at the liquor store saying, Dr. Bryce, you drink wine? And yes, I do. Even with the latest research, everything in moderation, including, by the way, moderation itself. But when it comes to discussions like this, topics that I have a really hard time wrapping my head around, like happiness and how often should we be happy and how do we get there and the physiology and chemistry behind it, et cetera, I'm left thinking about where I typically default to, and that's evolutionary biology. And I almost feel like we've distorted what it means to be happy. I imagine, if our ancestors could talk to us, they were probably happy, if not at least content, for food, shelter, and safety, most of sort of the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And maybe the question becomes, is that part of our modern day challenge, this sort of quest for consistent happiness when it comes to feeling and consistently manifesting happiness, that the bar for like owning stuff and being the best and becoming, well, to refer to Maslow again, self-actualized is maybe the only way that we ever get to feel happy. So the question becomes, maybe do paleontologists from your research have proof that our distant ancestors were happy or sought happiness? Is this a human thing to need it?
Yeah, this is a great point. And the reality is, if we go talk to Ross Geller or any paleontologist out there, that's for all the friends that are listening, the Friends reference. We weren't designed to be happy. We were designed for survival, to pass on our genes. And so and a good example of where this is still really existent in our brains is something called the negativity bias. So the negativity bias is our brains. I sort of think of it like pre-installed software. Like, when you get a new computer and you open it up and it has like the programs you're never going to use, you have to put on better ones, right?
Right.
But they come with it. So we are sort of born with this pre-installed software, which is called the negativity bias. And what that is that it's a tendency to focus on the bad or the negative things, even in the midst of a lot more good. So for example, if 10 people give you a compliment today and one person says one bad thing, when you go home tonight and you put your head on the pillow, what are you thinking about?
That's
The one
that
thing,
negative thing.
right?
How do you correct it? Now
Exactly.
you're worried about,
It
what
actually
you were
came from
wearing
a
at the
good
time
place.
you received that negative comment also.
Yeah, it actually came from a good place though, because if we hit rewind and go back in history, we always had to be on the lookout for predators and for danger, right? But what's happened is our brain hasn't caught up with the modern world. We're sitting here podcasting right now and we're not worried that like a bear is going to walk in and eat us, right? And so our brain is running this old software. And so part of it is like not our fault because that's what we were born with. And so what we have to do, and this happens with a lot of different cognitive biases that we see, is that one, we have to be aware of it. We have to know, hey, I was born this way. And then two, it's like, how do I upgrade my software? How do I install better software? How do I kind of override this negativity bias in our brain? And we do that by actually paying attention and starting to notice the good things in our life. And just like we look at like the science of habit formation, right? Any habit is most difficult at the beginning, but like once you do it over time, like did you have to really work hard to brush your teeth today? Hopefully not, right?
I've got a dentist as a wife, so I'm more, it's a rote. It's just habit now. But,
Exactly.
as a guy in my earlier years, I got to admit, and especially undergrad, it may have been a lower priority than it should have been. But no, I didn't have to think about it.
Right. Once we get used to something, it becomes habitual, right? This
Right.
automaticity thing. And so with the negativity bias, what we have to do is like, and people always ask me like, Gillian, like, I want to be happy. Like, what can I do? Like, what's the one thing I need to like do or buy or get or say, right? And I always say before we start adding to our list, right? We're all very busy. We all have a lot going on. Before we start adding things that we have to do, I think step number one is it's not about seeking like SEEK happiness. It's about seeing it. It's about noticing the good things that we already have in our life that we take for granted or we don't pay attention to. And I think that one of the silver linings that I've seen from this pandemic is that because I'm a happiness researcher, like I'm constantly asking people what makes you happy, right? All the time. And before the pandemic, common responses would be things like, oh, like the trip I just went on, the promotion I got at work, the vacation I'm going on, whatever it is. And now when I ask people, I'm hearing things like having coffee with my friend, like giving someone a hug, going out for dinner, right? So a lot of the things that we had in our life that actually do bring us a lot of joy, a lot of happiness, we tend not to pay attention to them. And so by starting to actually notice and see and be aware of the good things in our life as step one, what that's doing is one, it's making us aware of those things, but two, it's also helping us to override our negativity bias because we're choosing to give our focus to the good things. It takes effort, right? We actually have to actively think about it, but over time, it starts to get easier. And I think that that's something that costs nothing. And we already live our lives, and just to have some awareness about the things in our life, because that's the other piece is like, I'll ask people all the time, are you as happy as you possibly could be? And no one's ever told me yes yet. I haven't got a yes ever. And then I'll say, okay, well, what makes you happy? And a common pattern I notice with research participants is that one of two things will happen. Either like before they start their exhale, they've got an answer. My mom, my dog, my cat, my sister, my brother, like it's just like a reflex. Or there's like a really long pause. Like they really have to think about the answer. And so it's like, okay, well, if we're not as happy as we possibly could be, and yet we don't know what makes us happy because one, we didn't even have to think about it. We just had a reflexive answer, or we didn't know the answer. So it's about starting to ask ourselves, like, what are the things in my life that bring me joy? Like you started this podcast asking me, like, what makes me happy, right? We go all through the day, but to actually take some time to really answer that question for ourselves is a really great place to start.
And I've heard you say that happiness is more of a practice than a destination, in your TEDx talks. And anyone listening in, it's worth Googling Dr. Gillian Mandich and TEDx happiness. Great, pieces that you can listen to in a drive to work. And it's time well spent. Your health is an investment of time and resources, never an expense. This one's of time, and it's a great output. But I suppose, can you elaborate a little bit on how that mindset shift really can transform how we experience life? And actually, before you do, because I don't want to forget this, you said a couple of things really, important that I want to just quickly unpack. Then I'm going to ask you to answer that question. You said something about, the pandemic causing us to sort of reset and perhaps, redevelop a state. I think human psychology is really in part all about comparing. I mean, without comparison, we're like nothing, or at least we can't establish that comparison. So I definitely feel that, one thing I started doing routinely was a walk in the forest, although we knew about the health benefits to that long before I made that a daily practice. And I haven't stopped doing that. And I'll tell you, it's one of those things that in my day helps me to directly and indirectly experience happiness, whether or not it is the thing that makes me happy. It's part and parcel to my practice. So this whole thing then back to human psychology and comparison, and sometimes we just have to understand and appreciate that it's not the destination or where we're going, it's the daily routine and practice. And so again, I'm going to ask you, if you can elaborate on that mindset shift, like how do we do that comparison? How do we transform how we experience life, especially for those listening that may have sought help because of what they believe to be, potentially even a biochemical deficit, or a level of depression, or maybe they come from, trauma or experience in life where they just don't have a lot of happiness.
Yeah. So two things. One, I just want to, before we get into the sort of how, is to just touch on the distinction between mental illness and mental health.
Yeah.
And this is really an important thing. And so mental illness is sort of the same as like disease treatment, right? So if someone is experiencing depression or anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, right, that is mental illness to be treated. my work and the conversation today is about mental health. How do we focus on increasing our well-being? We all have days where we feel sad, but then it's not like depression where it's chronic for weeks and months on end. And so what's interesting is up until about the mid-90s, there wasn't a lot of peer-reviewed research on the mental health side of things. It was all disease, treatment, that sort of thing. What we've seen in the past 20, 25 years, Dr. Martin Seligman, he in 1998 was the president of the American Psychological Association. And when he gave his presidential address, he talked about this need to focus on the positive side of psychology. And that's sort of in the field seen as like the beginning, the founding of this field of psychology called positive psychology. So from there, we've now seen this growth where people are looking at, okay, well, we get one shot at life. How do we live our best life ever? How do we focus on building our mental health, just like we think about building our physical health through sleep, through physical activity, through nutrition? This is another facet where we think about how do we improve our mental well-being and our mental health. And that's a big piece of the conversation that we're having today, which is really cool to have. Right?
No, extremely well delineated. Thank you for saying that. And by the way, just as an aside, his great work, but I feel like some of this came right out of the playbook of the marketing team for the Oprah Winfrey Show.
Yeah, right? I know. And so the other thing is, I think about happiness the same way that I think about physical activity and the same way that I think about nutrition. And what I mean by that is so often, and you mentioned this, right? People think I will be happy when, fill in the blank, right? But the reality is, like we talked about, it's not a destination. I see happiness like a practice. And if we want to be happy, we have to practice happiness regularly. Now, people might be listening and be like, okay, Gillian, what does that mean? That sounds like a cute like quote card for Instagram, but like, what does that mean? Right? Fair. And it's, so you would never, after this podcast, say you went to the gym and you had the best workout of your life. You would never text me and be like, hey, Jill, I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness, right? You would never text that to anybody. Or you would never make like a green smoothie in the morning and put like all the superfoods in it and then be like, that was delicious. I've reached nutritional wellness, right? You especially know this. Lunchtime's going to roll around. We're going to be hungry. So we understand that if we want to be fit and healthy, we have to move our body on a regular basis and we have to choose healthy foods and provide our body with the supplements and the nutrients that it needs on a regular basis. And so instead of seeing happiness like a destination, which one is problematic because now we've taken our happiness and put it as contingent on something that may or may not happen in the future, right? So, but when we think about it like a practice, it brings it into today and it's like, okay, what can I do today to practice happiness? And a lot of our happiness, I sort of think about like a muscle. So if you want to get strong, you go to the gym. If you do one rep, doesn't really change your life. You don't really get that much stronger, right? But when you consistently go over time and put the reps in, then what happens is over time, you get stronger. And I think about our happiness like that too. It's like this muscle that we grow over time by doing things that make us happy. And then what happens is like our highs get higher, right? We get stronger. The other really important piece of this conversation though, is that a happy life doesn't mean that hard things don't happen. A happy life doesn't mean that job losses don't happen, that divorces don't happen, that health issues don't happen. That is part of life, right? Like a happy life doesn't mean we're just like smooth sailing, having like margaritas on the beach every day. That's not what it is. What happens is when we start to cultivate this skill and this practice of doing things that make us happy regularly, our highs get higher, we're stronger. But those challenging things, it's not that they go away, but they get higher too because we are more resilient and we're better able to cope with hard things when they happen. And I think that that's a really important piece of the conversation too, because it's knowing that, yes, and what we know is that the frequency of positive emotions is a much better predictor of our happiness than the intensity. Right. So we're better off having more small micro moments, I often call them, things of happiness, than like the one day when we go out on a shopping spree or something like that.
Yeah. No, that really makes sense. And you know what this makes me think about? There are two books that juxtapose each other on this topic. One, it's an oldie but goodie classic written by Douglas Kennedy called The Pursuit of Happiness. You probably read that 10 times. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's a title used by a number of different authors in different contexts. But it tells a story of, love and betrayal and redemption, across decades, and, how there's this sort of long-term goal. This idea that, again, it's not necessarily the journey, or rather the destination, but more it's the journey. But then that's juxtaposed by the author Chris Guillebeau, who wrote The Happiness of Pursuit. And this was a really cool book. I read this, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. Explored the idea of how he traveled the world. Every single continent was his goal, but trying to find purpose and fulfillment in the pursuit of these meaningful, what he called quests. And he defined that word very specifically. And if we all kind of get that. So quest, journey, purpose, goals, however you want to term it. And what this brings me to, though, and all of what you just said reminds me of, is the practice and where the people, I think, understand this and get it and know it the best, and subsequently, largely in part, live the longest lives. Centenarians in the blue zones. This is the work of Dan Buttner. Whether you're an ikigai, whether you're in Japan, or you're in Loma Linda, California, or you're in Costa Rica, or you're in parts of Italy, Sardinia, there are sections of the world where people understand and have defined the practice. They just call it, like I was mentioning, in Japan, they call it ikigai, which is purpose, right? And what are your thoughts on that? Like in terms of understanding, the practice being consolidated, and understand that, when you wake up in the morning and you can define your purpose, almost to your earlier point, if you can answer ultimately what makes you happy and turn that into a daily routine practice, it will probably turn around to amplify. It begets more happiness, with the exception, as you've said, that it's tempered with the idea that we're never going to achieve happiness every second of every day.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that. But first, I have a fun fact. Do you want to know a fun fact?
I always want to know fun facts. It makes me happy.
Yeah, me too. This is a good one. So the Declaration of Independence, right? It's written right in there. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? The inalienable rights. So the fun fact is that words sometimes change their meaning over time. Right? So when we think of the word pursuit, we think of like actively going out, seek, chase, get, right? That's what we understand pursuit to mean. Back when the Declaration of Independence was written, the word pursuit more meant like the word practice that we use today. So it wasn't about going out, seeking, whatever. It was about practice. It's about the habit. And so even back then, they know what we know now that we see from the research is that happiness is a practice. It's a habit. It's something that we have to work on. It's not something that we go and we seek and we find and we chase and pursue. So that's a fun fact. But I love that because and when you talked about like purpose or meaning, these are things that are highly correlated with happiness, right? And purpose and meaning can come in a variety of different ways. Like I do a lot of work looking at happiness in the workplace. And for some people, their work is their meaning, right? If you talk to, I just did rounds at the Department of Pediatrics this morning. So I was talking to physicians, and a lot of physicians, especially in pediatrics, are driven very much by purpose and meaning in their job, right? Some other people, they do their job as a means to have resources to do what they love in their free time, right? So they may love knitting or something like that doesn't actually generate revenue, but they work so that they can do what they love. So different people have different ways that they use work to find meaning. But across the board, if we look at happy people, they have in some capacity purpose and meaning in their life, whether that purpose is raising children, whether it's, the vocational purpose, but that's something that's consistent that we see because as humans, one, we're hardwired for connection, but we also want to know that what we do here matters and that we're contributing. Right. And so that is a really big piece of it for sure.
Yeah. And I feel like, in some way you can define this future happiness seeker, the individual who treats work like a means to an end just to get by, is exactly in that trap. I'll be happy one day when, and that when is maybe when they retire and can do their own thing. But it's just really not the reality. I mean, that when almost never happens. And even if you achieve the goal that you are set yourself up to achieve, it's never enough. really is appreciating, happiness in the moment. And typically, by the way, am I right or wrong by saying in the smaller things in life? Does that translate?
Yeah. And what's interesting too is you brought up like sort of this, I'll do this when I retire kind of thing. And what we see when we think about purpose is that and you mentioned Ikigai in Japan. So in North America, what we see is that rates of cardiovascular events significantly increase when people retire. And the hypothesis for that is that if someone's all their meaning and their purpose was work and they've retired and they don't have it somewhere else, we know that this can take a toll on our physical health. And we don't see this with people. So this is Japanese data, but what they saw was that people that had an Ikigai, a purpose or a meaning, their mortality, they studied for them for 7 years, their mortality did not drop nearly as much as the people that had no Ikigai, no purpose. So it even takes a toll on our physical health and our lifespan and our health span too, for that matter. But it's something that I think sometimes, especially with happiness, and we tend to not appreciate the effects that it has on every other part of our life, especially our physical health, right? Like we sort of don't really understand that they're so connected and they're so correlated. Like even one of my favorite studies with happiness and physical health, this was done pre-pandemic, was researchers brought people into a lab and they exposed them to the rhinovirus, to the common cold. And then they quarantined them for 5 days. And what they found was that the people that were self-reported as happier were far less likely to develop a cold compared to the people that weren't as happy.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Interesting. I've seen quite a lot of those studies and extrapolations of them, and the immune system certainly works a lot better when we are in parasympathetic mode. And you described this earlier. Paleontological research and studies lead us to believe, who knows how happy our ancestors of a few 100,000 years ago really were. I think they were content to have a fire, a cave, and maybe procreate. But at the end of the day, were they really such future thinkers? It's hard to know. But they certainly were, quote unquote, happy if they were otherwise safe and warm. That's changed. And certainly as a cohort you mentioned also, some of whom you work with, the younger teens exposed to social media. I want to talk a little bit about that as well, because in particular, the research coming out around, young teen females, it's just staggering. But what I want to get into, and I promise we will come back to that, is, this whole notion of like, can we actually make happiness if we understand it through the definitions that you've described so far, but extending that even into the physiology and the chemistry. So I've heard you describe us people as pharmacists. I mean, we have our body is a pharmacy of happiness compounds. And, if happiness isn't just something, we stumble on, right? We have to practice it and create it for ourselves. There is that to this whole notion. We just don't hope for it, I've heard you say. Other than sort of help us understand the first step in the creating of it intentionally, which again, even the example you gave earlier of, the practice of exercise, not just does that have to happen over and over to build better muscles, but also in doing that, you're actually upregulating endorphins, which of course leads to feeling just generally better. But here's the question: how do our bodies respond physically when we're happy, and what role do neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and GABA and oxytocin play, and how do we accentuate those if we're this pharmacy and we have the control?
Yeah, I love this. And I think that this is such an important part of the conversation, because one of my biggest pet peeves is when I go into like a home decor store, and you know how they have like the signs that like live, laugh, love that you put up in your bathroom or your kitchen or whatever, like home is where the heart is.
Sure.
There's one I see all the time that says choose happy. And it's such a pet peeve of mine, because it's not like we wake up in the morning and we like choose our outfit and we choose happy. Like it doesn't work like that for a variety of reasons, some of which you just touched on, is that sometimes we can get lucky. And actually the root word of happiness, hap, is a Norse word for luck. So there is an element of luck. Some days you might just wake up and your friend calls you and they surprise you with a visit and you have a great lunch. Like some days we just get lucky and things happen that make us happy. But the reality is that most of the time we actually have to be co-creators and we actually have to work at it. And so one, we have to look at what are the physical behaviors that I can do, right? And like you talked about, like exercise is a great example where
Non-negotiable, really,
yeah.
right? I mean, your body, your muscles in particular are emitting happiness molecules when you work out.
And just a note on the exercise thing. I think that sometimes people think that like what that means is that they have to go to the gym and do like a 60-minute high intensity interval training workout. And that's not the case.
Right.
Movement of any walking in particular, there was a study that was done, and on days that people walked, they were happier than on days that they didn't. And the other thing is it compounds, right? Like you might think, okay, well, what's a 5-10 minute walk in the morning? But if 5 to 10 minutes in the morning, even like the dog walks I have with Jocko, like we're out for, I don't know, 15 minutes, maybe, especially in the winter. He's a bulldog. He hates the cold, but I take him out 3 or 4 times a day. So there's an hour just right there but it compounds over time. And so we have to like remember that. And I think that the other question I get asked a lot about exercise is like, what's the best exercise for happiness? Like if I have a limited amount of time, what should I be doing? Should it be yoga? Should I be doing CrossFit or F45 or high rocks? What do I do? And the best exercise is the one that you enjoy, right? So some people like to do yoga or weight train or whatever.
And that you have the time for, and the one that you can be consistent with, right?
Exactly. That's the key, is that figure out what you like and be consistent, because it's like practice habit over time. That's the key piece. And so even 10 minutes of walking per day can greatly increase your chance of being happy. And we also see like there's tons of research that shows that exercise can be as effective as antidepressants for treating people with depression, right? So there's the physical piece, the endorphin piece of that. And then the other thing we sort of talked about, like dopamine, right? This molecule of pursuit. And think about it, like oftentimes if you think about what are the things in my life that really were meaningful and special, it's often something that you had to work at, right? Over time. Like I remember, because we talked about this, we fall into this thinking of I will be happy when, right? I fell into, and it's normal. It happens to all of us. It happened to me. I remember thinking I will be happy when I finish writing a PhD about happiness. But then I kind of caught myself in the thought pattern. And then I thought about it. It was because I didn't like spending like hours and weeks checking periods and references and grammar in my dissertation, right? That wasn't very fun. But the pursuit, what I was after was at the end of this, I'm going to have a dissertation that I'm going to present orally and then I'm going to defend. And that bigger goal that's where you get the like dopamine along the way, because you're actually working to something that's challenging, that's pushing you. And a lot of humans, we like that growth, learning, progress, right? And so a lot of these sort of neurotransmitters can help us with that because they keep us going, as opposed to the sort of complacent, like, oh, whatever, right? We don't get that same feeling when we're actually not doing anything, as opposed to if we're chasing a meaningful goal or working towards. It's probably a better way of saying that.
Absolutely. It's often what is born out of blood, sweat, and tears in the acute, short-lived moment of the day, and over time that feels the best, for sure. At the DNA company, we are very proud of our executive function, mood, and behavior report. We've got about 40 reports within a genomic assessment. So looking at DNA and then determining, at least in this context, where your genes, of course, you can't change your DNA. You can manage, however, genetic expression, but where your genes and the combinations of genes, you never look at a single gene and say, this is how this person must feel or behave, but pathway genomics, that's what we appreciate. And non-diagnostic. So your point earlier, we're not diagnosing mental illness or depression or ADHD, but we can see a multitude of different genes and predispositions of one's trend towards attention, focus, alertness, concentration, ability to sleep, which we should probably talk about as well. Their chance or a likelihood of being on a spectrum, because that's where we're all at, of, more happy-go-lucky versus a little more contemplative or introverted, or somebody who's more in that pursuit, hitting that next dopamine surge is their reason for living, So there's all these really cool ways in which, and here's the thing, once because I know you'll say this, I know you'll probably even desire to say this next, the genetic aptitude or the DNA is probably by far the least important component in the big scheme and grand scheme of happiness and achieving happiness. And I would agree with that. But whatever percentage it might be in the latest research, once you know it and you unlock it, for me, understanding how my body manages serotonin, which arguably, by the way, may in fact be the paramount happiness molecule. I mean, not on its own, but it's the one we're often trying to control. And science says, if someone's got a real problem in this regard, let's hit them up with a, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, antidepressant. Although I've heard you also say, it's not this linear, the opposite of happiness is not sadness. And that's a whole other topic. But the point here I'm trying to make is once you understand your genetic aptitude, you can hone in on where it is that you might spend time doing those things that should maybe improve that predisposition. So again, for me, I found out that serotonin was a bit of an issue. And knock on wood, I don't know what it is to be depressed. Thank God. But I know depression runs in my family. And I also know that when I learned that about 20 years ago, I started taking something called 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin. So I don't know. I have this question in my mind and I've never really stopped. I'm always supplementing on this as part and parcel to my routine along with the B complex. With my genetic predisposition, would I, at this age and stage, be more inclined to feeling less happy or more likely to feel depressed occasionally than if I didn't take it? I don't know. I'm not even willing to, try that experiment. But the big but is, when you know your genetic aptitude, you are more likely to then focus in on, is it exercise, diet, specific ingredients? In fact, frankly, certain drugs, pharmacogenomics is on, is on the same intervention list. What drugs are best suitable for your biochemistry? And so that's where we're at in terms of genomics. I think it's, real groundbreaking stuff. Yeah. If you, though, and here's my question to you. Well, first, answer, if you don't mind, do you know what the percentage of genetics plays a role in happiness versus, all this other stuff we're talking about? What is that?
Yeah, so this is a hot button topic in the happiness space. So, happiness research in and of itself is sort of, from a research perspective, in its infancy stage, right? We talked about earlier, it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that we started to see this research. So back a long time ago, Lycan and colleagues did a study because it's very difficult. I mean, as you know, to tease out environment versus genetics, right? Because they play together. So in this particular study, what they did was they took monozygotic twins, so genetically identical twins, separated at birth. Because the thought process being that exact same genetics, monozygotic, raised in different environments. So this can help us tease out, right, how much is genetic, how much is maybe environmental. And so then one of the leading happiness researchers, her name is Sonia Lyubomirsky. She's amazing. She wrote a great book called The How of Happiness. And on the cover of the book is a pie with a piece cut out. And so they called this sort of hypothesis the pie hypothesis, the pie equation, which is where they basically said about 40% of our happiness is genetics, 20% is our environment, and 40% is thoughts, actions, habits, the piece that we have a lot of control over. So this comes out, and then all these people get up in arms because it's very difficult on a population level across the board to come up with nice, clean numbers like that, right? Sure. It's sort of an oversimplification or, things like that. But I think that, instead of getting lost in the weeds of what the numbers are, the take-home message that I take from it is that basically our genetics do play a role, but it's almost like they set a range. And so where we land in that range is what's up to us, right? So like you said, you learn about your genetics, you're taking tryptophan, you're doing all these things, you're extending your range into the upper limit of what's possible for you. And we all do that. So it's we're born with what we have, but then knowing that it's what type of lifestyle in terms of nutrition, in terms of supplementation, in terms of our behaviors, in terms of all of those things, do we do to really get us into that upper range? And sort of in that same sort of vein of things that we've learned in happiness research. So when this work first started, there was this theory called the set point theory. And so what researchers sort of thought was that our happiness is sort of like a thermometer in a room. So like my temperature right now is set to 72 here. So if I open, it's freezing and it's snowing in downtown Toronto while we're recording right now. So if I open my patio door, it's going to get really cold in here really quickly, right? But then if I shut the door and leave it, it'll go back to 72. But if I turn my Dyson fan on and crank it up really warm, it's going to go above 72. And if I turn the Dyson fan off, it'll go back. So that's what people thought happened with happiness. So a good thing would happen, your happiness would go up. And then over time, you go back to baseline. And then something bad would happen or difficult or challenging, it would go down. But then over time, you kind of get back to your set point. And what we know now is that not only can we increase our happiness short term, right? So we can do things to boost our happiness, right? Go for a walk, go to the gym, whatever it is. But when we think about it like that habit, that practice, then if we do it like that, we can actually sustain it at higher levels. So it takes us out of that range. So our happiness doesn't quite work like a set point, which I think is something that's a really empowering message, because to know that we have some autonomy over our happiness, that it isn't just our genetics set out a map and there we go, right? To know that we can actually do something and see meaningful change. I think that that's, instead of fighting over, is it 40%, is it 39, is it 42? It's no, we have a range. And genetics do play a role, but we also play a role, and we have a lot of power and responsibility to live into that and to figure out those things for ourselves so that we can get the most out of our genetics, whether we learn about it from testing and developing that information. That's a huge piece of it. And knowing for ourselves, like, what are the things that I like to do? And really empowering ourselves with that information so that we can live our best and happiest life.
Right. I agree. I couldn't agree more. And of course, the literature and science supports it, and that's why you're saying it. You almost made me think of a blue chip stock, the ones we can bank on. The good news being that it's going to always kind of go up, but that if you look at it under a microscope, the hour to hour, day to day, week to week, month to month, you will see that there's ups and downs. But the good news is that generally it's trending to go up. And of course, informed by genomics would be the equivalent of informed into your blue chip stock investment by an investor or somebody who's understanding of, how to interpret that information.